fikum. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Alex, bringing you the truth in a world turned upside down. If you're listening, you've made it through another night. But who knows how many more there'll be. Everything has changed. I'm not talking about a bad storm or a collapsed economy. No. This is something far worse. Something that came without warning. Something that walks in the dark. And it doesn't stop until we're all dead. Yes, I'm talking about the vampires, the night creatures, as some call them. And believe me, this isn't some movie. This isn't fiction. It's our new reality. You see, this wasn't a slow burn apocalypse. No, this was instantaneous. One night, everything was normal. The next, chaos. Streets filled with people running, shouting, but not for help. For survival. In the blink of an eye, the creatures took over the night, and with it, our lives. We are hunted like prey. The sun still rises, but it's no longer enough to protect us. The vampires rule the night, and humanity? We're scattered, isolated, fighting for scraps of food, shelter, and most importantly, safety. Those of us left. We've learned quickly that the old world doesn't exist anymore. Let's rewind. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment the world started crumbling. One moment, you're scrolling through your phone. Headlines filled with celebrity gossip, political drama, and the usual distractions. The next, the first attacks, the first sightings. People thought it was a hoax, a viral marketing stunt, something designed to get clicks. But then, the screams and the blood. There was no denying it. Vampires coming out of the shadows, making our world their playground. I don't know where you are listening to me from right now. Maybe you're in one of the shelters, or maybe you're huddled in a dark corner of an abandoned building, praying that you make it through another night. Wherever you are, remember this. Stay hidden after sunset. If you haven't learned that lesson yet, you're already too late. These creatures, they're not just bloodthirsty monsters. They're organized, smart, and ruthless. They know what they're doing. And you, well, you're a target. People have started calling them night creatures. But let me tell you, this isn't a Halloween story. These monsters have dominated every city, every town. Our night sky, it's no longer ours. They've claimed it. And when the sun falls, you know you're no longer safe. When you hear the first scream, you know they're near. I've spent the last week with survivors. People who've seen things, who've lived things that, well, most of us would never wish on our worst enemies. It's hard to describe the kind of terror you feel when you realize you're the prey and they're the hunters. The stories I'm about to share with you aren't easy to listen to, but it's the reality we now face. One of them, a woman named Sarah, barely made it out of a collapsing city. She was one of the lucky few to escape. But at what cost? What's left of a person when they've seen the night take everything they loved? I'll tell you, nothing. She is nothing now. Just a shadow of her former self, trying to hold on to any semblance of hope. We spoke for hours, but at the end of it all, there was just one thing that kept repeating in her mind. John, I saw my family. I saw them turn. They didn't even fight. They just gave in. The vampires, they just took them, and there was nothing I could do. Imagine that. Your loved ones, becoming one of them. It's not just the fear of being killed. It's the fear of being changed, transformed into something inhuman. And for those of us left, there's a choice to make. Do we fight, or do we hide? Let's take a moment to reflect on how we got here. If you're still alive, you've probably asked yourself the same questions I have. How did this happen? Why weren't we ready? And most hauntingly, could this have been avoided? The origins of this apocalypse are shrouded in mystery. Some claim it began with a virus, An unholy mutation born from the depths of biological experiments gone wrong. Others whisper of an ancient curse, something humanity disturbed when we dug too deep, either literally or metaphorically. The truth doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that the creatures are here and they've made their intentions clear. The night belongs to them. It started quietly. A shadow on a deserted street. A scream in the distance cut short. At first, the report seemed outlandish. People drained of blood. Bodies with no marks except punctures on the neck. Social media lit up with theories, pranks, hoaxes, even viral marketing for a movie. But then the patterns emerged. The disappearances, the strange activity in remote towns, and finally, the undeniable evidence. Footage of a creature moving so fast it was a blur, striking with inhuman precision. By the time the media caught on, it was too late. They were already everywhere. The first attacks were in isolated areas, places where help was slow to arrive. A farmer in Kansas reported seeing glowing red eyes outside his barn before his livestock vanished. In a small Italian village, an entire family disappeared overnight, leaving behind a single room splattered with blood. These were the early signs, the warnings we ignored. By the time they hit the cities, they didn't come quietly. No, they came like a storm. And these creatures, these vampires, they aren't like the ones in our stories. They aren't romantic, brooding figures. They're predators, pure and simple. Their strengths? Let's just say, if you think you can outrun them, you're wrong. They move faster than the human eye can track, striking before you even realize they're there. Their strength? It's monstrous. I've heard stories of them tearing through steel doors like they were paper. And intelligence? Don't think for a second they're mindless. These things plan. They learn. They adapt. But they're not invincible. At least, not yet. Sunlight still burns them, turns them to ash, if they're exposed long enough. Silver? It's effective, though hard to come by. Garlic, believe it or not, has its uses. It doesn't kill them, but it slows them down, repelling them long enough for you to escape. Yet these weaknesses feel like fleeting advantages. Every day it seems like they're finding ways to overcome them. How long until even the sunlight isn't enough? Now, let me share some stories. Stories that haunt me even as I tell them. Dr. Claudia Reed, a virologist from Atlanta, was among the first to realize what we were dealing with. She studied the initial outbreaks, analyzed the victims. She tried to sound the alarm, but bureaucracy got in the way. Her reports were buried under red tape, dismissed as overreactions. By the time she finally got someone to listen, the creatures had already infiltrated her lab. Her last message was chilling. They're more than a virus, they're evolution. No one's heard from her since. Then there's the Harris family. A quiet, ordinary family in the suburbs. They thought they were safe in their little corner of the world. But safety is an illusion now. It was their daughter, Sophie, who first noticed the shadows, moving unnaturally fast outside their home. She called for her parents, her voice shaking. They barricaded the doors, turned off every light, hoping to stay unnoticed. But these creatures, they don't rely on sight alone. They can smell fear, sense a heartbeat. It wasn't long before the pounding started. Not knocking, pounding, as if a battering ram was slamming against the walls. The Harris family survived, but not without scars. Sophie refuses to speak now. Her parents carry the weight of guilt, knowing they couldn't protect their neighbors, their friends, and yet they're the lucky ones. Most families don't make it through a night like that. But it's not just the creatures themselves that terrify me. It's what they represent, a complete and total shift in the balance of power. Humanity, for all our technology and innovation, has been brought to its knees by predators older and more primal than we can comprehend. The night used to be ours to enjoy, to rest. Now it's a battlefield, a place of terror where even the smallest sound can mean the difference between life and death. Some survivors have tried to organize, to fight back. They've shared strategies, using UV lights to create safe zones, layering their homes with garlic and silver. But these are temporary measures at best. Every night, more people vanish. Every night, the creatures grow bolder. And yet, there are those who refuse to give up. They whisper of hope, of a way to fight back. Scientists working in secret to understand the creatures, to find their true weakness. Refugees banding together, creating fortified camps in remote areas. But hope is a fragile thing in times like these. Every step forward feels like 2 steps back. So what can you do? How do you survive in a world where the darkness is no longer safe? First, never let your guard down. Even in the daylight, keep moving. Keep finding ways to protect yourself. Second, remember their weaknesses even if they feel like myths. Garlic, silver, sunlight, use whatever you can. Third, and most importantly, don't lose hope. As long as there are survivors, as long as there is light, there's a chance to fight back, a chance to take back what's ours. By now, I think we can all agree on one thing. This isn't just a fight for survival. This is the end of the world we knew. I'm not talking about the end of a society or a few isolated incidents. This is the collapse of everything we ever took for granted. Our governments, our cities, our economies, all of it shattered in an instant. It wasn't just the vampires that destroyed us, though they sure played their part. No, it was the fear, the chaos, the very darkness that these creatures brought with them. Let me walk you through it. In the beginning, the world tried to react. I mean, they had to, right? Government scrambled, military forces mobilized, and emergency broadcasts flooded every screen and radio channel. But here's the thing they didn't realize. The vampires don't play by the rules. You can't shoot them with conventional weapons. You can't quarantine them. You can't even predict where they'll strike next. No, these things move like shadows, faster than any soldier, smarter than any strategist. Governments failed. It didn't take long for fear to turn to full-blown panic. At first, cities were the battlegrounds. Skyscrapers turned into tombs as people barricaded themselves in. But no matter how high you built your walls, no matter how deep you went, the night always came. And when the night came, so did they. The streets became hunting grounds, places of terror and desperation. Do you remember how it felt to walk through a crowded city? The hustle of the day? The buzz of life around you? Now the cities are empty. The silence is deafening. The few who remain are just waiting for nightfall, because once the sun sets, there's no safe place left. What about the rural areas, you ask? Well, that's where the real isolation began. The cities fell fast, but the countryside? The countryside became something else entirely. People huddled into small groups, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But as food supplies dwindled, as the vampires spread, entire towns simply vanished. Entire villages were swallowed by the night. And let's not forget the economy. I know. No one really thinks about the economy in the middle of an apocalypse, but hear me out. It wasn't just the physical destruction of cities or the fall of governments. No. It was the simple fact that no one could work at night anymore. Every profession that relied on nighttime hours, truck drivers, night shift workers, even things as simple as grocery stores that stayed open late, everything ground to a halt. People couldn't even go outside without risking becoming prey. Businesses collapsed overnight, banks shut down, and with that came the collapse of entire industries. All of it swallowed up by the darkness. But the collapse of the world we knew wasn't just physical. No, it was psychological too. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to fear the dark? Not the kind of fear you feel when you're a kid, or maybe even the kind of fear you'd feel if you were just camping out in the woods. No, this is different. This is a primordial fear, the kind that makes your skin crawl before the sun even sets, because once the night falls, so do they. And it's not just fear of the dark that eats away at you. It's the paranoia, the trust issues, the constant need to be alert, to second guess every person you encounter. You see, trust, it's a luxury you can't afford anymore. Survivors? You don't know who they are. Not anymore. Could they be hiding something? Could they be working for the vampires, or worse, have been turned already? There's no safe place, no safe person. Even the refugees, those who sought shelter in camps, found themselves looking over their shoulders every second, not just for the vampires, but for each other. There's a camp just outside what used to be a bustling city that I know about. It's barely holding together, just a bunch of people huddled together in an old stadium, trying to keep their wits about them. But the tension there is suffocating. The first night they were there, they barely slept. Everyone was too scared to close their eyes. The camp is so overcrowded now that it's a ticking time bomb, ready to explode. People fight over food. People fight over space. And worst of all, people fight over trust. I spoke with a man, let's call him James, who used to be part of that camp. He told me how they watched one of their own fall prey to the creatures one night. The vampires didn't just attack. Number, they played with their food. James told me he saw it happen. The man was pulled into the dark, but not before he screamed. And then there was silence. That silence, James said, was the worst part, because they didn't know whether he was dead or whether he was changed. James left the camp after that. He said it was too dangerous to stay. I don't blame him. The thought of staying in one place too long, knowing they could find you in the dark, it breaks you. But here's the thing about trying to survive alone. I met another survivor recently, a woman, let's call her Maria. She's been living on her own for weeks, hiding out in an abandoned city, alone, cold, and scared. She's been trying to reach out to other survivors, but the problem? The city is crawling with vampires. At night, the streets are no place for anyone, let alone a single woman, alone and vulnerable. Maria? She's learned to stay hidden during the night, to trust no one. She told me she's seen other survivors before, but none of them survived the night, not because the vampires found them, but because they turned on each other. And when I asked her what she thought about the future, she just shook her head. There is no future, she said. Just night after night waiting for the dawn, hoping there's a dawn. It's a brutal world we're living in, folks. No one can predict what tomorrow will bring. The vampires, they're here to stay. And as we try to rebuild, to survive, we have to face the one thing humanity's never had to confront before. We are no longer at the top of the food chain. In the end, it's not just about surviving the night. It's about holding on to the last shred of humanity we have left. And right now, that's harder than ever. I've been hearing a lot of you say it. Is this really our new life now? Well, unfortunately, yes. What we once considered normal is now nothing more than a memory. Something to tell the younger generations about when the time comes. But for us, for those of us left, this is the harsh reality we live every single day. Life under vampire rule isn't just about staying alive. It's about existing in a world that's been rewritten by predators that only come out at night, and the desperate measures we've all taken to adapt or survive. And I'm not just talking about physical survival. This is about psychological survival too. If you're not careful, your mind can break faster than your body. The isolation, the fear, the uncertainty. It's the kind of pressure that turns people into something else, something unrecognizable. So let's talk about what it's like, day in, day out. The first rule of life under vampire rule: you don't go out after dark. Period. The sun is your only ally now. When the sky begins to fade into dusk, everything changes. There's no safe space outside once the creatures awaken. The vampires, With their enhanced strength, speed, and intelligence are predators like we've never seen before. They don't just hunt for blood, they hunt for fear, for desperation, and they feed off it all. During daylight hours, you might still feel some sense of normalcy. The streets aren't entirely empty, but they're quieter than they used to be. The rush of life is muted as people keep to themselves, eyes nervously darting from shadow to shadow, fearing that the darkness may come sooner than they expect. We've all learned to become experts at keeping our heads down, and our movements swift. Venturing out for food, water, or supplies is a calculated risk, one that feels less like a simple errand and more like preparing for battle. Those brave enough to scavenge or trade often end up looking over their shoulder, terrified that the night is just a breath away. And trust me, you never really know when it's coming. In this new world, the night is the enemy, and it's always waiting, lurking just outside our doorsteps. Homes once bustling with life are now dark, silent fortresses. No longer is there laughter in the halls or chatter across the dinner table. It's all about securing your space. Every door, every window, every crack in the wall is reinforced. Steel bars are the new curtains, and UV lights are the new night lights. People have learned to barricade themselves inside to create a safe haven that will hopefully hold long enough to get through another night. The lucky ones have underground bunkers, makeshift havens that might be your best shot at surviving if the vampires find your home. But these places are not without their own dangers. How long can you really stay holed up? How long before the resources run out? And when it comes to food, well, you might want to think twice about that can of beans you just found. Some of the more resourceful communities have taken things to the next level, forming fortified compounds. These places aren't just safe havens, they're thriving hubs of defense and survival. UV lights, silver-coated barriers, and garlic-laden walls are common sights. Safe zones are built on a system of surveillance, barricades, and community vigilance. Survivors work together, constantly scanning the perimeter, ready to react at a moment's notice. But even within these walls, life isn't easy. Trust has become a rare commodity. What's left of humanity has split into factions, some working together, others willing to do whatever it takes to secure their safety, even at the cost of others. Some survivors have become collaborators, offering up weaker members of their communities to the vampires in exchange for protection. Others become hoarders, stockpiling resources while others go hungry, trying to preserve what little they have. Surviving under these conditions takes more than just physical barricades. You need to learn to live with the creature's weaknesses. Sunlight, obviously, is the most effective deterrent, but it's not always easy to rely on daylight. It doesn't last long enough to give you a real edge. So we turn to what we can use: garlic, silver, and UV light. Garlic, the old folk remedy that turns out to be not so foolish after all, has proven to be a reliable deterrent. Hanging garlic in your home, covering your doors and windows with it, might just buy you enough time to make it through another night. It's not a guarantee, but every little bit helps. Silver, another ancient weapon, also comes in handy. But silver isn't just for jewelry anymore. It's been melted down, fashioned into weapons, and used as a means of self-defense. Silver-tipped arrows, knives, and even crossbows have become vital tools in this new world. The creatures are vulnerable to it, though, be warned, it's not as simple as just pointing and shooting. These vampires are fast, and silver weapons can be difficult to handle, especially when you're already running on fumes. Then there's the UV light. UV lights are the lifeblood of survivors. We rig up makeshift lights in places we need to keep safe, around our shelters, in our hideaways, and in every corner of the home. UV lights are expensive, though. They're hard to find, and most survivors are reluctant to share them. But those who can afford them are lucky. The lights keep the vampires at bay, and when they're used strategically, they can even kill the creatures. But no matter how many precautions you take, the psychological toll is something you can't prepare for. It's one thing to prepare for an attack. It's another to survive the constant fear of knowing that every night could be your last. I spoke with a young girl the other day. Her name's Sophie, and she's about 10 years old. She was hiding in an abandoned building with her mother when the vampires came. Sophie's mother didn't make it, but Sophie did. She told me about the night they came for her family, how they heard the sounds of scratching at the door, how her mom told her to hide, to stay quiet, to stay alive. Sophie stayed hidden, even though she could hear the screams. She never saw her mother again. I don't know how I made it through, she said. I just wanted to be with her, but I stayed quiet, and I think that's why I'm still here. Her story's heartbreaking, but it's not unique. Many survivors have lost everything. Parents, children, siblings, all taken by the night creatures. And what's left? Nothing but the remnants of a life they once had. The survivors aren't just dealing with the trauma of loss. They're living with the fear that the next night could be the end. Another group of survivors I spoke to found what they thought was a safe haven, a hidden compound deep in the forest. They'd heard rumors about it, but when they arrived, it was nothing like they imagined. The compound was overrun by vampires. The survivors they thought they could trust were working with the creatures, turning over anyone they thought might be a threat. It was a massacre. The group barely escaped with their lives, but they came back to tell the story of how a place meant to offer protection had become a trap. And that's the real danger here, folks. It's not just the vampires outside your door. It's the ones who pretend to be human, the ones who wear masks, who are out to exploit your fear and desperation. You can never be too careful. And so, as we continue to struggle through this darkness, this new reality, the one thing that keeps us all going, what makes it possible to wake up every day, is the hope. The hope that we can adapt, that we can survive, that we can outlast these predators, but the question still hangs in the air. Will we ever reclaim the world we once had, or will we simply fade away into the shadows? Stay tuned. The night is long, and we're just getting started. Survivors, I know it's easy to feel like all is lost. The darkness is relentless, and the creatures that haunt it seem invincible. But let me tell you something, the fight isn't over. Not yet. Humanity has always had a way of rising from the ashes, clawing our way back even when the odds are stacked against us. This time is no different. We've spent months running, hiding, and surviving, but survival isn't enough anymore. People are starting to fight back. It's messy, it's desperate, and it's dangerous, but it's a fight nonetheless. Let's start with the scientists. Even in the face of complete devastation, there are still those who refuse to give up on the idea of a cure, a weapon, anything that might give us an edge against the vampires. In makeshift labs, hidden deep in bunkers, far from the vampires' reach, researchers are working around the clock. They sift through the little information they have about the creatures, examining their physiology, their weaknesses, their origins. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a virologist who once worked for the CDC, has become a beacon of hope for those who believe in science. She spent months analyzing blood samples from survivors who've had close encounters with the vampires. Her theory? There might be a genetic anomaly in some humans that makes them resistant to the vampire transformation. If she can isolate it, she believes she can develop a vaccine, something to protect us from the creature's bite. But this kind of work isn't easy. Resources are scarce. The vampires don't exactly allow supply chains to run smoothly, and every trip to scavenge for equipment or samples comes with enormous risks. Dr. Vasquez lost 3 members of her team during a supply run last month. Still, she presses on, driven by the faint hope that her work could turn the tide of this war. Then there's Dr. Rahul Singh, an engineer turned weapons designer. He's been working on a way to amplify UV light into a concentrated beam, a kind of portable sunlight that could be used to wipe out entire nests of vampires. His prototype is still in the testing phase, but reports from his underground workshop suggest it's already claimed a few vampire lives. If he succeeds, this weapon could give humanity its first real chance to go on the offensive. While the scientists work behind the scenes, survivor groups are taking the fight directly to the vampires. It's not enough to hide anymore, not if we want to take back what's ours. During the daylight hours, when the vampires are at their most vulnerable, these groups launch coordinated attacks on known vampire nests. One such group calls themselves the Daybreakers. They're a ragtag team of ex-military personnel, civilians, and anyone willing to pick up a weapon and fight. Their mission is simple: find the nests, eliminate the creatures, and reclaim territory inch by inch. Last week, I spoke to their leader, Captain Marcus Kane. He told me about their most recent mission, an attack on a sprawling vampire nest hidden in an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of the city. It was a high-risk operation, but they couldn't afford to let the nest grow any larger. The team moved in during the early morning hours, armed with UV grenades, silver-tipped spears, and makeshift flamethrowers. The fight was brutal. Vampires are relentless, even when weakened by daylight. But the Daybreakers held their ground. By the end of the day, the nest was destroyed, and the hospital was once again safe for humans. Captain Kane's words still ring in my ears. We're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for the future, for the chance to build a world where our children don't have to fear the night. For every story of loss and despair, there are stories that remind us why we keep fighting. Stories of resilience, of bravery, of humanity, shining through even in the darkest times. Take Sarah, for example. She's not a soldier, not a scientist, just a mother who refused to give up. When her town fell to the vampires, she managed to escape with her 2 children. For weeks, they lived in hiding, moving from one abandoned building to the next, scavenging for food and water. One night, they were cornered by a vampire in an old warehouse. Sarah fought back with nothing but a broken piece of wood, managing to injure the creature long enough for her children to escape. Her bravery didn't just save their lives, it inspired others in her community to stand up and fight as well. And then there's the story of Ethan, a teenager who led a daring mission to rescue a group of survivors trapped in a vampire-infested mall. Ethan had lost his family early in the apocalypse, but instead of giving in to despair, he chose to help others. Armed with a flashlight rigged to emit UV light and a map of the mall's layout, Ethan navigated through the dark, evading vampires and guiding the survivors to safety. His courage didn't just save lives. It reminded us all that even the smallest acts of bravery can make a difference. Perhaps the most promising story of hope comes from Dr. Vasquez's lab. A few days ago, she announced a breakthrough, a survivor named Liam, who was bitten by a vampire but never turned. His blood holds the key to what she's been searching for, a natural resistance to the vampire's transformation process. Dr. Vasquez believes that with more time and resources, she can develop a vaccine that could protect humanity from the vampire's bite. It's not a cure, it won't bring back those we've lost, but it could give us a fighting chance, a way to stop the spread, a way to survive. Of course, this discovery comes with its own risks. The vampires seem to sense when we're on the verge of something big. Just last night, a group of them attacked the bunker where Dr. Vasquez and her team are working. They managed to hold them off, but the message was clear. The vampires know we're fighting back, and they're not going to let us win without a fight. So, where does that leave us? We're not out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, there's a spark of hope. Humanity has always been at its best when our backs are against the wall. We adapt, we fight, we survive. The vampires may have the night, but we have something they don't: hope. And as long as that hope burns, even faintly, we have a chance. Remember, survivors, every small victory matters. Every life saved, every nest destroyed, every step forward. It all adds up. This fight isn't over, and it won't be easy. But as long as we keep pushing, keep fighting, we have a chance to reclaim what's ours. Survivors, if you're still with me, then you're probably holding on to the same hope I am. That maybe, just maybe, we can find a way out of this. But I'm afraid this is the part of the story where things get darker. Much darker. You see, as much as we've learned to survive, the vampires have learned too. And not in ways we expected. We thought we had them figured out. We believed we could fight back. We were wrong. The first sign came with the evolution of the creatures. At first, they were just predators. Mindless, bloodthirsty, ruthless, but predictable. We knew their patterns. We knew when they hunted, how they attacked, what time the night was most dangerous. And we thought we could prepare. We set up UV lights, we reinforced our shelters, and we learned to fear the dark. But now, things are different. They've adapted. It started with whispers from the survivors on the outskirts of our strongholds. It was always the same report. Something was wrong with the vampires. They weren't burning under the sun like they used to. Their eyes weren't glowing in the same way. They were faster, smarter, stronger. At first, we didn't believe it. We thought it was the stress getting to people, the paranoia. How could they have evolved so quickly? Evolution doesn't happen overnight, right? Or so we thought. But it didn't take long before we saw the truth for ourselves. A small group of survivors made an attack on a nest. They thought it would be easy, just a quick strike to take out a few bloodsuckers. But when they arrived, the vampires were waiting. It was as if they knew. They had been watching. And when the sun began to set, the attackers noticed something strange. The vampires weren't reacting to the fading sunlight the way they used to. In fact, they seemed to be immune to it. The weapons we had, silver, garlic, even the UV light traps, none of it worked as effectively anymore. We were watching the beginning of something terrifying. These weren't the vampires we'd fought before. They had learned, adapted, and evolved. Every attempt we made to get ahead of them seemed to end in failure. And that sense of helplessness, well, it's something we're all too familiar with now. We couldn't outrun them. We couldn't outfight them. We were losing ground. Fast. The worst of it came one night, a night that none of us will ever forget. We'd been building up our defenses, hoping that if we could just last long enough, something might change. But that night, they came for us. In a way we didn't think possible. A coordinated, devastating assault on one of our largest strongholds. One of the few remaining places that had held up against the vampires for months. It started with a sudden silence. A quietness that felt unnatural. The kind of silence that made your skin crawl. Then came the screams. And before we could react, the first wave of vampires broke through the barricades. The survivors in the stronghold did what they could. They fought with everything they had. But it wasn't enough. The vampires had evolved. They knew how to breach our walls. They knew how to overwhelm us. And as the night wore on, more and more of our people were dragged into the shadows, their screams swallowed up by the dark. I remember hearing the voices on the radio just before the broadcast cut out completely. A leader, a woman, strong, resolute, ordered the remaining survivors to retreat to the lower levels. But we knew it was too late. They couldn't run anymore. They couldn't hide. When the sun finally rose that morning, only a handful of us remained. The stronghold, once a symbol of hope, was now a graveyard, and we were left with nothing but the weight of the destruction they had wrought. And yet, in the midst of that loss, something even more dangerous began to emerge, the question of sacrifice. As we regrouped, we faced a harsh truth. We were outnumbered, outclassed. We needed more than just weapons. We needed to find a way to stop the vampires once and for all. But what were we willing to lose to do it? The question echoed in every survivor's mind. How many of us would be willing to die to save others? How many would be willing to give up their lives for a chance at turning the tide of this war? I'll tell you this, The decision was never easy. A few brave souls volunteered for a dangerous mission to infiltrate a vampire nest deep in the heart of their territory. The mission was clear: destroy the nest, destroy their leader, and give the rest of us a fighting chance. But the cost was high. Many knew they wouldn't make it back. Some of the survivors, veterans of the war against the vampires, didn't hesitate. They volunteered, knowing they would die, knowing the risks. And it wasn't just the warriors. There were civilians too. Parents who sacrificed their chances of survival to save their children, to buy time for the others to escape. The question wasn't whether they would die. It was whether their sacrifice would be worth it. And then came the most gut-wrenching moment of all. A leader, a man we all trusted, made the ultimate sacrifice. He was the one who'd kept us together through the worst of it. The one who'd organized our attacks and maintained our hope. But when the vampires began overwhelming our defenses, he made the decision to stay behind. He led the last wave of fighters, buying precious seconds for the rest of us to escape. As the sun dipped below the horizon that day, we knew we were leaving him behind. We knew he was walking into his own death, his final stand, to protect those of us who still had a chance. It was a moment of pure sacrifice, one that will haunt all of us for the rest of our lives. But that's what we've become, isn't it? A world full of sacrifices. It's not about whether we will survive. It's about what we're willing to sacrifice to keep others alive. And sometimes the weight of that choice feels like it could crush us all. As the sun rises and the last of the vampires retreat into the shadows, one thought lingers in the back of our minds. What happens when the night comes again? It's hard to say whether we're winning or losing. Every small victory feels like a fleeting moment of hope, but we all know the truth. This war is far from over. The vampires are still out there, still adapting, still growing more powerful by the day, and we have to decide what we're willing to risk next. Are we ready, or will we fall when the night returns? The fight for humanity's survival is far from over, and the greatest challenges lie ahead. If we survive the next night, will it be the last? Stay tuned, survivors. The night is always darkest just before the dawn, but with creatures like these, who knows when the next dawn will come? Survivors, if you're hearing this, then you've made it through the worst of it. You've made it through the darkness, the blood, and the terror that has defined our lives for so long. But the question remains, what now? The vampires are no longer the invisible threat in the night. The danger is no longer a faraway whisper in the shadows. It's here. It's real. And we've seen it all. We've lived through it. And now we're left with the aftermath, the hard part, the rebuilding. In the weeks and months that followed the worst of the attacks, the survivors began to regroup. We knew we couldn't just hide forever. We couldn't allow the night to define us any longer. So we started rebuilding, piece by piece. Towns and cities, once thriving with life, reduced to rubble, were slowly being cleared and fortified. A new world was emerging, one built on the ruins of the old. The first thing we had to do was create safe zones. You've probably heard it before, but let me tell you, it wasn't easy. Survivors didn't trust anyone at first. And who could blame them? After what we had endured, the vampires weren't the only predators in this new world. People, humans, our own kind, had become something else too. They had adapted in ways that made them just as dangerous as the creatures we once feared. Trust was a rare commodity, and in the early days it was worth more than gold. We built our safe zones in the most secure places we could find: abandoned cities, underground bunkers, mountain caves, anywhere that could be fortified against the night. Those who had any experience with construction, engineering, or even military tactics were sought after. Walls were erected, and UV lights were set up in key areas. Anything to keep the vampires at bay. It was a system born out of necessity, and necessity, as we learned, is often the mother of innovation. The hunting began soon after. With the night creatures still lurking, the survivors took it upon themselves to scour the land, hunting down any remaining vampire nests. Every day, expeditions were sent out into the wilderness, Groups of brave souls, armed with weapons, UV flashlights, silver, and anything else they could use, ventured into areas still haunted by the creatures. Each night, the number of vampires grew smaller. But that didn't mean the danger was gone. Far from it. Every encounter felt like a gamble, each time we ventured out, hoping the remaining vampires wouldn't evolve yet again, learn how to fight back harder or worse, attack us in new ways. The danger was real and the fights were grueling. But amidst all this, something remarkable started to happen. Humanity began to rebuild, not just physically, but psychologically. We began to form new bonds. Old cities, now fortified and safe, slowly saw people trickle back. They came in groups, families, wanderers, refugees. We found new ways to live in a world that no longer welcomed us. And while we did our best to rebuild, we could never escape the lasting scars the apocalypse had left on our minds. The psychological toll was immense. For months, we lived in constant dread. The fear of the dark was no longer an idle thought, but a visceral instinct. I don't need to tell you what it's like. You felt it too. The shadows now hold something more sinister than just night. It's a reminder that something lurks out there, whether it's the vampires themselves or the fear that drives us to mistrust the very people we once called neighbors. That's something we'll never fully shake off. We've learned to live with it, yes, but it's there, always. The nights are still, tense, even now. We've learned to sleep in shifts. There's always someone keeping watch. The sound of footsteps, every rustle in the wind, sends us into a panic. Is it a person? Or is it something else creeping closer in the dark? Will it be another night where we have to fight for our lives? Will we even make it to sunrise? But there's also a part of us that knows this isn't the end. This is just a new chapter in our history. And this time, we won't make the same mistakes. The moral toll on humanity hasn't been less severe. While there are many good people left in this world, some have fallen, become something darker. The desperation, the fear, it's driven people to make decisions that we might have thought impossible before. There are still those who are struggling to hold on to their humanity, fighting their own internal battles. And some have made impossible choices. One such moment came when a leader of one of the survivor groups, a man who had seen too much death, was faced with an impossible decision. A group of survivors had been trapped by a vampire nest. The only way to save them would be to sacrifice a handful of others, strangers, people they didn't know. It was a cold, hard decision, and when the time came, it was made. The leader chose to sacrifice those few to save the many. Was it the right choice? Did the lives of the few outweigh the lives of the many? I'll never know. But I do know that the toll on his conscience was profound. In the days that followed, we saw more moments of bravery. There was a young woman, no older than 17, who led a daring rescue mission to save a family trapped in the heart of a vampire stronghold. She was surrounded by dangers, a ticking clock in her mind, and yet she pressed on. And when she made it back, carrying the family to safety, she was hailed as a hero. But there was no celebration, no relief in her eyes, just exhaustion. A weariness that only comes from knowing how close she was to losing it all. The toll of sacrifice, of choice. These things linger in the corners of every survivor's mind. No one can escape it, but after all this, there is still hope. It's a fragile thing, yes. It's a light that flickers in the distance, but it's there. There are whispers of new cities being built, places where people can find peace again, and yes, peace, it's a word we almost forgot. As we rebuild, we must remember this. We are still human, we've faced the worst, and we've come through it together. We've learned to live in the shadow of night, but we've also learned that the night will not define us. As I speak to you now, the sun is rising. The darkness is retreating. But the question still remains. Will it ever be safe again? Will we ever truly be free from the fear of what lurks in the shadows? Or have we simply learned to live with the knowledge that at any moment the night could return? The answer, my friends, is simple. Hope is a fragile thing. But it's enough. For now, it's enough. As long as there is light, there is hope. We will rebuild. We will survive. And when night falls, we will be ready. As the sun rises and the last of the vampires retreat, one thought lingers. What will happen when the night comes again? And will we be ready for it? Before I go, let me ask you for something. If this broadcast gave you even a glimmer of hope, if it made you feel a little less alone, then please, like and share it. Your support helps us keep going, helps us reach more people who need a little light in their darkness. If you have any suggestions or feedback, drop a comment and let us know. Your voice matters, and we're here to listen. We're bringing you new broadcasts every day, so don't forget to subscribe. Together, we'll keep this spark alive. I'll see you tomorrow with another broadcast. Until then, stay warm, stay safe, and remember, you're not alone.